Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to decode something absolutely fascinating, how our modern world actually operates behind the scenes. We're diving into the groundbreaking sociological theories of Wright Mills. He was this brilliant thinker who kind of peeled back the shiny mid-20th century American veneer to ask one very direct question. Who actually runs society? And, where do the rest of us fit into that whole machine? So think about your own day-to-day life for just a second. Do you ever feel like you're just a replaceable cog in a massive, impersonal machine? Maybe you're constantly navigating this endless corporate bureaucracy, answering to layer upon layer of management, and kind of just feeling overwhelmed by a society where all the biggest decisions seem to be made by someone else, somewhere else. Well, you definitely aren't alone. In fact, that exact feeling of powerlessness and detachment is the very core of what we're unpacking today. A lot of these concepts actually stem from Mills's foundational work back in the 1950s. Through his landmark books, The Power Elite and White Collar, Mills conducted what was really the first full-scale study of how power is structured and distributed in the United States. He neutrally reported on the stark realities of advanced capitalism and the massive growth of bureaucracy. He was essentially pulling the curtain back on the American dream, showing us this highly structured reality operating just beneath the surface. Section 1. Who really runs society? The power elite. Okay, so let's start by looking right at the very top of the social food chain. According to Mills, society isn't run by some scattered, random group of wealthy individuals. No, it's dominated by what he called a triumvirate of power. And this consists of three distinct pillars: the military warlords, the corporate chieftains, and the political directorate. These are the folks heading up the state security apparatus, the massive economic corporations, and the political establishment. Mills basically argued that as these three massive institutions blew up in size during the 20th century, the people leading them started wielding an unprecedented level of influence over literally everyone else's daily lives. And here's where it gets really interesting. Mills notes that these three domains, the military, the corporate world, and politics, they overlap heavily. The leaders in these fields, they aren't just isolated in their own little bubbles. Their circles coincide. You've got admirals and generals taking on political roles, corporate CEOs rotating into high-level government positions, and politicians relying super heavily on corporate structures. They mingle, they share the same interests, and together they form one unified, overarching power elite. The crucial takeaway here is that their immense power doesn't just come from their personal bank accounts or prestige. It comes directly from the fact that they occupy the strategic command posts of our entire social structure. Because they sit right atop these massive, centralized bureaucracies, any decision they make has enormous consequences for the rest of the population. In fact, Mills points out something mind-blowing. Even their failure to act, just deciding not to do something, is itself an act that has way bigger consequences than anything the average citizen could ever pull off. Section 2. The Cogs. Rise of the white collar. So what about the rest of us? Well, to understand the modern worker, we need to shift our focus down from those elite command posts and look at a massive shift that completely reshaped society. See, the old middle class of the 19th century was defined by independent, property-owning entrepreneurs. We're talking about the self-sufficient farmer, the small business owner, the independent craftsman. They owned their tools and directly controlled their livelihoods. But as these massive corporations grew, they totally displaced that group, giving rise to the new middle class. And this new class, they're dependent, salaried, and highly rule-bound. They don't own the property they work on, and they definitely don't own the products of their own labor. Let's look at the hard numbers for a second. Driven by corporate expansion, new tech, and a total explosion in the service sector, the white-collar workforce absolutely skyrocketed. By 1950, white-collar workers jumped to make up 37% of the entire American workforce. Self-employment plummeted, and millions of people were basically swallowed up into massive corporate bureaucracies to work as clerks, salespeople, and lower-level managers. By the mid-20th century, we are talking about over 25 million Americans doing non-manual white-collar labor. To put that into perspective, that is a massive chunk of the population trading their true economic autonomy and entrepreneurial independence for institutional security and routine. They became dependent employees, constantly subject to hierarchical oversight. Suddenly, things like punctuality and strict compliance were prized way more than independent craft or judgment. Section 3. The personality market.
Okay, which leads us to what I think is one of the absolute most fascinating and maybe relatable concepts in this whole explainer, the personality market. In this bureaucratic, service-oriented economy, you aren't just selling your physical labor or your technical skills anymore. Nope, this is the complete commodification of intimate personal traits. Think about it. Your cheerfulness, your politeness, your adaptability, they are now literally traded for commercial profit. To survive and climb the ladder in the white-collar world, you are basically forced to sell your social demeanor. You have to mold your own personality to perfectly fit the needs of the corporation. And naturally, this creates some profound alienation. Mills famously wrote that workers must sell by the week or month their smiles and their kindly gestures. Just let that sink in for a second. Your friendliness is no longer a genuine personal virtue. It's a standardized commodity. It's a PR tool executed with what Mills so brilliantly called anonymous insincerity. It essentially turns the modern worker into a cheerful robot, completely exchanging authentic emotion just to keep their job safe. So let's walk through how this builds into a vicious cycle of deep psychological burnout. Step 1, you commodify your personality just to get and keep the job. Step 2, you're constantly suppressing your genuine emotions, forcing a smile and faking interest just to appease management and clients. And then step 3, because your work lacks any real creative control or deeper meaning, you endure immense psychological boredom. You actually become estranged from your own true self. You might be physically comfortable, sure, but psychologically, you're completely adrift.
Section 4. The mass society impact.
So let's zoom out. What happens when you combine this incredibly powerful centralized elite at the top with millions of politically powerless, emotionally alienated white-collar workers in the middle? Well, Mills observed a pretty stark contrast. While you have this elite calling all the shots at the top, down at the bottom, a mass-like society is formed. Because the white-collar middle class is so fragmented and lacks any real unified power, it trickles down to create a society that is highly disorganized and politically passive. The sheer weight of these massive bureaucracies has effectively neutralized the general public's ability to act collectively. And because of this massive structural imbalance, Mills concluded that in this heavily manipulated system, what we're actually left with is a democracy in form and rhetoric, rather than an actual substance and practice. He neutrally points out that, sure, the mechanics of democracy are still there, we still hold our elections, we still have campaigns, but the true defining power remains deeply concentrated at the top. The underlying population is essentially just managed and manipulated by these interlocking institutions of the elite.
The real-world consequences of this dynamic compound pretty quickly. First off, we see widespread political apathy, mostly because everyday people feel like their voices just don't penetrate those massive bureaucracies. Then we see a real shrinking of genuine public discourse. We're also sold this illusion of upward mobility where people chase job titles and credentials without actually gaining a shred of real institutional power. And maybe most notably, everyday folks, feeling totally powerless against the machine, seek an escape. They distract themselves through what Mills called synthetic leisure, obsessively focusing on consumption and status symbols to try and find the fulfillment that their alienated work lives deny them. Which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to wrap up on. If the structures of our society are literally designed to centralize power at the top while alienating the masses in the middle, we have to ask ourselves, are we destined to just remain cheerful robots, seamlessly functioning within the bureaucracy? Or is there a way to pierce through all that synthetic leisure, reclaim our genuine autonomy, and actually challenge the concentration of the power elite? It's a massive structural puzzle from the 1950s that honestly feels more incredibly relevant today than ever before. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning the structures around you.